So you've decided that you want to start a podcast. Well, what's the first question that you need to ask yourself? And it's a question that I got from one of my business mentors, Brandon T. Adams. And that question is, what does success mean to you? What would success represent to you if you were to start a podcast? And it's slightly different to setting goals for a podcast, and I'll tell you why. So, in my opinion, a podcast is a compelling conversation which connects and converts. So let's break that down a little bit. One of the questions that I most often get asked is, how long should a podcast be? And I heard a quote recently from James Cridland, the editor of Pod News, which is one of the biggest podcasting news websites. And here's a quote which goes, "There's no such thing as a podcast which is too long, only too boring." I think that's a bit of a clue in terms of the compelling element of a podcast conversation. Quite often you listen to a podcast and there might be a bit of an exchange, whether it be at the start or there might be some superfluous information. And you think, this isn't necessarily enhancing the podcast, this bit of time in here. It's not necessarily helping me to achieve the outcome that I feel was set out for me at the beginning of the podcast. And in that case, that's a bit of a clue that maybe that information, that audio shouldn't necessarily be in the podcast and could easily be edited out. I heard an example once that years ago when we used maps, we would look to get from point A to point B, and there would be so much superfluous information in terms of, you might have to take the third right, but there's still two streets that you have to almost consider whether you're taking that right. Whereas these days with GPS, we can literally plug in point A and plug in point B, and we don't need to worry about any of the superfluous information. We don't need to worry about those two streets and whether we need to turn off them, because we know that it's going to be the third turnoff. And in many ways, your podcast needs to be a little bit like that. You need to identify the point A and the point B that you want to take people to, and only include information and audio that's going to enhance that process and enhance that conversion, as we'll speak about a little bit later. In terms of connection, it's really important to consider who do you actually want to connect with and what outcome do you want them to achieve in that. Maybe you just have a podcast where you just want people to listen. You just want people to connect with the podcast as almost a standalone bit of content, and maybe put their hand up as a fan, maybe get in touch with you for a bit of feedback, leave reviews, that sort of thing. That's probably the most common podcast listener and the most common type of people that people are trying to connect with on a podcast. But then if, for example, you have a product or a service that you're trying to sell, well, in that case, you're not just trying to connect with everyday people, for lack of a better term. You're actually trying to connect with potential clients and potential customers who will have some sort of need and interest in the product that you're trying to sell. You may also have a community that you manage. Maybe you're a part of a sporting community. Maybe you're a part of a school. If you have an existing community already, the way that you interact with those people is going to be slightly different than if you're looking to compel people to enter the community in the first place. For example, you may just be looking to promote interaction rather than looking to expand the reach and essentially get as many people into your community as possible in the first place. You may also be looking to connect with potential employees. You may be working in an industry that's quite competitive and quite difficult to employ some of the best staff. But if you have a podcast where you're not only able to present yourself as a brilliant place to work, as a relatively good place to work, as someone in your industry, you could also actually begin the onboarding process and start to convey some of your values, philosophies, and processes before someone's actually started working for you. And the final element of compelling conversation which connects and converts is, of course, the conversion. And this goes a little bit to what I was talking about before as well, with the outcome and looking to get people from A to B as quickly as possible. There are a range of different conversions that you can look to include in your podcast. Maybe you're just trying to convey some particular information. Maybe you're trying to get people to actually be able to implement a skill that they've gained from the podcast. Maybe you're looking to help someone change their perspective in a certain way. Maybe you're looking to compel someone to buy something or to become a client and buy a service off you. Maybe you're looking to get someone involved or to interact with you as a podcaster. Or if, as we said before, if you have someone in an existing community, maybe you're looking to get those people in that community to become a lot more involved, a lot more interactive, and the podcast can sit there as something that they are able to do that with. And maybe you just want people to become a fan of the podcast. Maybe you want people to just interact with your information, interact with your style of presenting, and then you can look to leverage that further later on, whether it be sponsorships or affiliate relationships. So a compelling conversation which connects and converts. And I think that question of what does success mean to you is a really important one to ask at the start, because going through those questions in terms of who do I want to connect with, what do I want to compel people to do, and what do I want to convert people in terms of their perspective or their ideas or any of that sort of thing. If you go through those, you'll essentially get your list of goals in terms of these are the people that I want to reach. This is largely what I want to achieve in the podcast. But by asking that extra question of what does success mean to you, it really allows you to evaluate those goals. For example, the goal might be to get more clients. Say you have a service business and you want to get more clients. Well, the idea of success could be to use the podcast as the sole marketing arm of the marketing machine for my business. I only want to spend time and money on the podcast because I believe that's the most efficient way to market my business, and therefore success would represent not having to spend any other money on marketing, for example. It could be success is to interview someone in particular to then be able to present an option to them in terms of working together later on. Success might mean to you to be thanked by someone in a way that suggests that you've really made an impact on them. And in those situations, we're actually extending the idea of goals, almost putting us in the position of having achieved those goals, and then we're really able to quantify exactly how much we've been able to achieve from our podcast. We've been able to quantify the success of our podcast based on the goals that we've originally set up in the first place. So I think that's an incredibly important question to ask yourself when starting a podcast, is not just what goals do I have for the podcast, but it's actually what would the ultimate success for this podcast represent. And that should help you evaluate whether or not your podcast is on the right track as well.